And everybody can see the slides all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, of course, we're reading chapter 6, and the main theme is animals. And this comes in the context of a contrast from chapter 5 between the open and closed forms of positionality, with plants representing the open form and animals the closed form. So then chapter 6 is telling us more about the animal, the closed form. And last time we talked about some initial distinctions that Plessner made between decentralized and centralized types of the closed form, and he's going to go into some more details about contrasts between those here. And he's also already kind of reaching forward to a distinction between the centralized animal form, and which is it's a kind of like higher animal form. If you think about, like, most mammals, animals with more developed nervous systems would fit into this kind of centralized type. And then finally in chapter 7, he's going to focus on humans, which he describes as an eccentric form of positionality. So that's going to be yet another contrast. So some of the sections that I'm going to be talking about today, 4 through 7, I mean, in some parts of those sections, he's continuing to make contrasts between the items that have sort of been in play earlier, like non-living versus living, plants versus animals, decentralized versus centralized. But then he's also often pointing ahead to distinctions between any of those things and the eccentric form of positionality. So what I think he's doing in these sections is a little bit more specific or focused than what he's done in sections 1 through 3, which has been just sort of setting things up for getting into more detailed discussion of some of these issues. And sections 4 through 7 discuss some topics that will be familiar from psychology and to some extent philosophy, about I think maybe psychology is more of the sort of home base of this literature, about animal perception, how animals perceive their surrounding world, or their the surrounding field. Umfeld, I think, is the German for surrounding field, and the contrast between different types of perception or experience of a surrounding field by animals in section 4. In section 5, of course, talking about intelligence, and he has in mind there things like problem solving and what Kohler called insight, Einsicht, which Kohler had claimed to find surprisingly in the problem solving abilities of non-human primates, of chimpanzees, within his primatological research in the 1910s and 20s. Then in the last 2 sections, Plessner is going to discuss memory, which ends up being actually a really big and important topic for understanding animal or organic life in general, but the animal form of organization, and a lot of other psychological topics. So memory is, of course, very important, and we find its importance again here. So that's the very basic outline. And getting into more of the details in section 4, I think there are sort of 3 parts to this section. There's an introduction to a problem, which is basically how can we tell what the world is like for animals. And this is a problem that's been wrestled with in a number of different research traditions in psychology, and people often whole research traditions often make guiding assumptions about how to do this, how to kind of model or understand or think about the kind of experienced worlds of animals, what animals experience, what the world is like for them. And they range from approaches that say it's not possible to even talk about it to approaches that are very specific about it. So he wants to just sort of say something about where he stands in those debates initially. And then he dives into discussion of two prior researchers, Volkelt and Kohler. And he thinks that Volkelt's research is particularly relevant for understanding the way that the surrounding field appears to decentralized animals. And Kohler is particularly relevant for understanding how it appears to centralized animals. And Uxkol is in the background here too. Plessner had already discussed Uxkol and expressed some disagreements with Uxkol in the earlier sections. So he may, that will come in occasionally, but it's sort of in the background of what's being discussed. So getting into a little more details in this first section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually spend a little bit more time on this in the earlier parts and a little bit less time in the later parts, and raise some kind of provocative questions about the later parts. I actually think the later parts of the chapter are in some ways easier to understand than the earlier parts of this section of the chapter. So the problem, as Plessner sets it up, is that he's affiliating himself with something he calls animal psychology, and presumably Volkelt and Kohler are examples of that, but it's not entirely clear like who he has in mind, if not just Volkelt and Kohler. But he does distinguish this animal psychology tradition or approach from behaviorism. He doesn't call it by that name, but he says nothing more than a physiology of stimulus and movement. Comparative biology, like Uxkol, and Cartesian dualism. Now, the problem with Uxkol, interestingly, a lot of people today are excited about Uxkol because what they see in Uxkol is a kind of solution, is a kind of alternative to behaviorism. They see Uxkol as like giving us a way to talk about what animals experience. But Plessner actually sees Uxkol as much more agnostic than that about what animals experience. And that's something he disagrees with Uxkol about. He thinks that Uxkol is too physiological. Uxkol is too thinking about the relation between animals and their Umwelt in a kind of way that tries to be agnostic about what animal experience is like. And so that's what he means by comparative. Uxkol, he thinks, operated in something like just distinguishing what parts of what we would call the environment or the surrounding world, the sort of total environment, what parts of that environment animals have some kind of stimulus response to and engage with in their motor activity. And so that is too neutral for him. And he also wants to disagree with Cartesian dualism, of course, because for all the reasons that he set out in the earlier chapters. There's problems of interaction between two completely different kinds of substances and so on. And he mentions that he thinks animal psychology must be interpretive, but he says it's not just any interpretation goes. This is part of his disagreement with Cartesian dualism and with like mysticism and vitalism and other things like that. But so it needs to be interpretive, but it needs to be a disciplined interpretation, or the interpretation needs disciplining. And he described some steps that researchers have made in the direction of this kind of interpretive animal psychology. So one is that there's been an abandonment of atomism about psychic elements, so moving in the direction of a more Gestalt psychology rather than an atomistic or associationist psychology. And there's been a recognition that instincts have a kind of latitude, kind of range of behaviors that they enable, so that instinct is neither incompatible with some spontaneity or some freedom of response to conditions. It's not incompatible with some environmental responsiveness or contingency. But also it's not incompatible with consciousness. So it very well may be that there are conscious states or reactions that are themselves describable as made possible by instinct or as a form of instinct. And so it's basically taking instinct to be a much wider category. And at one point in this section, Plessner talks about we have to use biologically meaningful categories. And I think what he's talking about there is he's actually referring to things like evolutionary theory and and a kind of more informed, biologically informed approach to animal behavior, where you have to really think about what kind of organism is this, what kind of interaction, what kind of relation does it have to its environments, what are its species typical needs, and modes of reaction to its environment, so on. And then he, interestingly, in just like a single paragraph, describes reflex as a kind of subset or effect of instinct. So he says we can actually think of reflex as kind of made possible by instinct. So what he has in mind there is that instinct is a very broad category that includes environmental variability. It's not incompatible with that. And it includes things like both reflexes and conscious reactions. So it's a kind of resolution in a way of the innate acquired contrast, the nature-nurture contrast. He's sort of saying, no, you have to understand organisms as having a certain range of behavior. The range of behavior is given by their instincts. And those behaviors can include all kinds of things, reflexes, conscious actions, and so on. Okay, so then in the remainder of this section, he discusses these two prior researchers. And I think the most important distinctions here are in bold on the slide. He reporting on Volkelt's research describes these things that Volkelt calls complex qualities, which he says is what animals are responding to. And Plessner thinks this applies better to decentralized types of organisms than to centralized ones. Like the spider, for instance, was one of one of Volkelt's research subjects was spiders, and he noticed that the spider, for instance, won't move to consume a fly that doesn't appear to it in the right way by triggering its web and trying to escape, basically. So, but other kinds of there isn't a kind of sensory atomism account of what it is that the spider is reacting to. The spider will react to features in its environment that have a certain form, regardless of the specific sensory content of that form. So maybe a better example here is with mice, for instance, trained to respond to square shapes, that a square shape is a signal that there's food. And it doesn't matter the size of the square or the color of the square. There's something about a kind of transposable figure, a figure that can be larger or smaller, that can be that can have a variety of permutations. So that the idea here is that these complex qualities have a kind of gestalt. They're not reducible to some kind of simple sensations. They're rather kinds of complexes of sensations. And they can even include complexes, they can even include components that we might not think of as sensory, but more like bodily or features of a situation that like it's only after this event occurs or when the spider is in this state that the spider will respond to this cue. So these things, as a kind of metaphor, Volkelt thought of as transposable melodies or figures, complex qualities. Now, Plessner wants to distinguish this complex quality idea as well from actual perception of things. But then he goes on in the next part of the section to distinguish things and objects. So we have sort of three levels of objectivity here. We have complex qualities, which have a kind of gestalt. They're not just sensory atoms or associations, and they can't be reduced to them. They're rather relational. They're kind of like relational entities, or they're a set of, or a pattern of sensory elements or sensible elements. Then there are things which centralized animals experience, but centralized animals don't yet experience anything in their environments as objects. That's reserved for humans. And the distinction there is that objects have a kind of independent existence. Plessner writes of them as being perceived as things existing in themselves. And so humans distinguish their own perceptions. They can distinguish their own perceptions of objects from the objects themselves. They can, they recognize that that there's a continuity of the object, that the object still exists when it's not in their perceptual field. They can reason about absent objects. They can think through, relations between absent objects or permutations of absent objects and so on. Whereas things, this mode, this sort of higher than complex qualities mode of objectivity that centralized animals experience, are somehow still interwoven with or attached to the experience, the animal's relation to the surrounding field and its experience of the surrounding field as a whole. So they're less detachable. They don't have this character of negativity or of being able to be extracted, or being able to be called, maybe abstracted or distinguished from the subjectivity of the subject, distinguished from other objects in the field. So when Plessner is describing Kohler's research with primates, how many of you are familiar with that research, The Mentality of Apes by Kohler? How many people have read that or read of that, know something about that? Okay, so almost everybody. But in describing those experiments, Plessner says it is indeed a mark of the recognition of thinghood, the recognition of a kind of stable source of possible, or a stable element of possible motor interaction within the environment. When we look at cases like Sultan, the sort of most impressive of the chimpanzees that Kohler studied, putting together two sticks to make a longer stick that's long enough to reach some food. There's something that's a kind of incipient objectivity there that's higher than the level of just complex qualities. There's greater detachability of those sticks, of those things in the environment, than in the case of complex qualities, but it still doesn't arise to this level of recognition of objects as existing in themselves. And Plessner thinks it's particularly interesting that the chimpanzees were able to take actions that in the short term look like they're moving the organism further away from its goal, but are actually in the long term moving it towards its goal, which he calls segmented actions or kind of indirectness. So for instance, if you have a cage and the chimpanzee is on one side and the food is here, and there's a stick that can be used to push the food but can't be used to pull it, then it was found that chimpanzees would learn to push the food to the other side of the fence and then would walk around to get the food. Now, pushing food away, right, is an action that looks like it's getting the organism further away from its goal rather than closer to it. And so Plessner thinks that's very, because I mean, and it's important. This is not a kind of action that's like prepared by instinct. I guess maybe Plessner is like assuming that with these actions. So there's some kind of insight into the situation, indeed, as Kohler had put it. There's some kind of awareness, greater awareness of one's own, the sort of interrelation and variable permutations of combinations of elements within an action field, within a field of possible actions. Remember, we had kind of derived this idea of an action field in the earlier sections. It comes from kind of awareness of relationships between one's own body and objects in the environment, the relation between one's own body and other elements of the environment. And it's reserved for centralized animals rather than decentralized ones. Okay, so I'm sure there will be a lot more to talk about with this. In the next section, we get a lot more about some of the things that are introduced in this section, like this negativity or perception of lack of absence, and the relation between that and objectivity and subjectivity and space and time. So now I'm gonna bunt a little bit. It's a baseball metaphor. It means like you don't really hit the ball out of the park. You just kind of tap it to manage to get to the next base. In this section, there's a thesis, I think, that awareness of all of these things arises together and depends on the same basic capacity. These things are all reserved for the human form of experience or awareness or cognition or whatever. They don't appear they don't appear in the centralized type. They only appear in the eccentric type. And these include a perception of concrete individualities and abstract generalities, negative qualities, homogeneous space and time, empty space and time, objective things, and states of affairs versus what Plessner calls field conditions. And I found the passages where he described that particularly illuminating, actually, for what he has in mind and the difference between human and animal perception of environments. It's basically that like animal perception of their environments is always, the elements are never fully detachable from one another, and the environment is never fully detachable from the subjectivity of the animal, from its frontality, from its from what it's directed to, what its goals are. Whereas humans are able to detach more. They're both able to detach more of the different parts of the environment and think of them as kind of like in or out of the environment. They're able to kind of pull them in or out analytically, and they're able to detach themselves from the environment and recognize the difference between their own, say, desires or pursuits, goals, and like what things are in themselves. And so the question is, why would all these arise together? Is it that like they're all ultimately derivable from the negativity part? Is it that they're, what, I mean, at one point, Plessner, he's again, this is kind of like deduction of the categories, right? This kind of like Kantian or Hegelian deduction of categories. He's sort of making an argument that these things are analytically connected with one another. They're dependent on one another. They're conditions. There's something that's a condition of possibility of all of these that's the same that we are trying to understand. And he makes arguments like, that the perception of a concrete individual as an individual, identifying something as an individual, or identifying a generality, noticing something that's generally true of a set of individuals or of individuals of a certain type, that both of those things depend on recognition of negative qualities, that you can't have recognition of individuality or of generality, what he calls genuine individuality, ekta. Genuine individuality, pure individuality, or pure generality, ekta. Genuine is the way we translated it. But you can't have that unless you have recognition of negation or absence. Why would that be? Is it that you need to be able to recognize that he does say higher animals can recognize similarities between situations in a kind of associationist sense. They can recognize similarities, but they can't get to true generality, which requires what? In a way, maybe being able to analytically abstract, or being able to analytically remove features of objects, being able to see that some of the features are irrelevant for the generality, whereas others are, some of the features are irrelevant for the generality. I'm improvising a little bit here to try to make sense of this. I welcome your discussion of it further. And why would that be connected with objectivity? I mean, I should actually add to this list subjectivity. Because animals can recognize that their own bodies are capable of certain things. Like they can recognize like that piece of food is far enough away from me that I can't get to it and escape the predator at the same time. But so they can use their perception of their own bodies and their own body's capability in their response to the environment, which is different from the decentralized form. So centralized animals can do that, decentralized animals can't do that. But they can't recognize that there's a difference between their perception of the environment and what the environment itself is, or there's a difference between how they're seeing this object now and what this object itself is. So that's the point about recognizing subjectivity. And then finally, we get to discussion of memory, and this will close us out on the introductory presentation. So the big concept I think here that's introduced in section 6 is that of the historical basis of reaction from Driesch. I think it's historische Reaktionsbasis in German. There's a precursor in non-living things. He gives the example of a gramophone, like a record, right? Where what music it plays when you put it on, when you play the gramophone. Is a gramophone a record player? I'm not sure, but we use a record and a record player as an example. Like what music plays when you put the record on the record player depends on what grooves have been put into the record. So the present there depends on the past. And a lot of non-living things are like that. But the way that the present in organisms depends on the past is different. And what we have with the case of organisms, I mean, so he ultimately wants to say there's something, because this section is focused on animals, he's going to say there's something distinctive about memory in animals in contrast to plants. But there are even precursors of what is distinctive about animal memory or animal relation to the past in organisms, with features like functional adaptation or fatigue, which even plants exhibit. So there's a case where there's a kind of like effect of the environment on the organism. And I'm not sure exactly what he would say about the relationship between that non-living and kind of basic living form of functional adaptation or fatigue. But with memory proper, we could say, with the kind of memory that appears in animals, memory, the kind of relation to the past that appears in animals, we have a relation to a past which implies a kind of distance between the animal and the past. And there's also what he calls a mediation of the past by the animal's frontality, or a mediation of the past by the future. So the idea there is that like what is remembered, or what parts of the past are relevant to present action, are filtered through the organism's ongoing life process. And that means that memory is selective. In some ways, you could say memory is creative. It's responsive to features of the current situation, like what is important to be remembered, or what parts of the past, and how are those parts to be put together so that they're relevant for the organism's life activity. And so another way that can be put is that, I think that gives a good enough picture of the basic idea there. And then in the following section, a little bit in this section and also in the following section, Plessner is concerned to like explain some features of memory that have appeared in the psychological literature but have been difficult to explain or understand sometimes. And he thinks his approach does a better job of explaining or helping us to understand them. So one is that it's actually really hard to get an organism to mechanically reproduce whatever it perceived. You think about what it takes to memorize a poem. It actually takes a lot of work to memorize a poem. If memory was just a matter of the organism just recording what entered its sensory field, right? Then reciting a poem would be easy. We would all have photographic memories, right? But instead, I mean, I know I'm talking about humans now, but this is also the case with animals. To get a mechanical reproduction of some kind of evidence that the animal remembers precisely the sensory inputs, precise features of the sensory inputs, and in a regular mechanical way, is actually really hard. Animals have to be trained up for that. And why would that be? It's because that doesn't actually matter. That's not what, I mean, that's all secondary. Memory functions primarily to serve the organism's frontality. It operates primarily in a way that's already structured by the organism's ongoing life process. And that involves things like, needs and ongoing, life processes and so on. It also explains forgetting. I mean, so if you thought that memory was just a matter of, again, recording what was perceived, then you might be surprised that there's so much forgetting that goes on in memory. But if you think of it in Plessner's way, you can see how if memory is always selective and always mediated by frontality, then a whole lot is not going to be remembered. Of course, a whole lot is not even going to kind of make it to the table for being put together into some kind of action guiding memory. There will be and so then there's this long passage where he describes this destruction of the past into elements by memory, and I think the idea here is really interesting and provocative, though it's a little bit hard to articulate. I think the basic idea is that, if you're trying to understand animal memory, or you look at animal memory, it kind of has this form of selectively putting together pieces of what has been sensed or experienced, and combining them in a variety of ways. So it has this kind of feature of of not allowing the past just to be what it is, right? So that the first steps of memory, Plessner says, are destructive. The first steps are already carving up, cutting. You can think about this as a kind of temporal version of what people like Volkelt and Uxkol were talking about with an Umwelt. There's a sensory melody. There's a response to some parts of the past, but not all, and that selectiveness is already destructive. And then he talks about pre-memory filters briefly. So he's pointing there to the phenomenon that what is remembered seems to depend in part like a priori, or it's a contribution of the organism rather than being able to be built up purely from associations. So there's something like a kind of innate filter, categories, innate ideas, something like that. That seems pretty hard to deny from a modern biological standpoint, that organisms have such filters in terms of what they remember, don't remember, and that's perfectly compatible with everything that he's been talking about. He doesn't have to build up the selectivity from atomic associationist elements. And then he also finally, just as a kind of an aside at the end, distinguishes between these pre-memory filters and the category of instincts in general. I think the idea there is that instincts is a broader category than these pre-memory filters, because instincts have to do with basically anything that kind of restricts the range of possible action of the organism in advance. So that should apply to these pre-memory filters, but it should also apply to lots of other things. So we shouldn't kind of get confused by the idea of something being prior or a priori and think that those are necessarily exactly the same thing. Okay, that's enough for me. I look forward to talking about with you and hearing your interpretations.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. This was, again, very nicely done. You always preface your presentations with a little qualifier that you'll do your best and everything, and then you just, go and kick ass. I always find this very interesting.
Oh.
So I think that, yeah, basically you've covered, I mean, of course, there's so much nuance in basically all the sections that we've covered, but the general outline was very nicely and neatly delineated. So one thing before we start debating the whole thing, maybe as a contribution to some of the things that we were saying at the very beginning, I think that one of the more tragic aspects of this book is that people probably get so confused and or bored before they get to these parts, which are basically by far the most interesting and stimulating parts and the most valuable contribution of Plessner, that most of them give up, So that's another, I would say, tragic segment or aspect of this particular book that maybe Plessner wasn't paying enough attention to when he was, writing that initial lament. as to why he was overlooked by so many other thinkers. But yeah, anyway, any comments, questions, reflections?
I guess I have a very specific question, maybe a little terminological. What is the difference in Plessner's view between Ding and Sache? Because he makes this point about animals being able to see into the nature of relations between things, so Dinge, but they can't see into the Sache-Verhalte. And I'm curious, I don't know if he makes clear what his conception of Sache is as opposed to Ding, because this is, I suppose, a relevant distinction given the this is German we're talking about, and it doesn't get carried into English. So if anyone has any insight about this difference between Ding and Sache, it'll be very interesting to hear. Maybe our German speakers can also.
Well, can Sache be translated as fact?
Yeah, I thought like it would be the distinction between thing and object, or am I completely wrong now?
Yeah, for sure.
But so Sache is object, I would say.
Yeah. However, it's not translated in a. So yeah, he says that just as consciousness of the thing, of the object as a thing, eludes the animal, so does consciousness of the state of affairs, which is Sachverhalt. And then he sees only in the field conditions. I think that I haven't really checked these parts with the original, so I don't know how he uses the term, but maybe if we stick to the thing and object distinction, so the crucial thing is that the animal does not have the capacity to either experience things or states of affairs. So Sache and Sachverhalt, he's playing on the same word here. These are things, these are objects that are
it's interesting that English never formulated a similar distinction between Sache and Ding, but Slovene also has this distinction, reč and stvar.
Yeah, well, they have the words, but for the most part, philosophers probably, or at least the ones that I'm familiar with, haven't really cashed in on this distinction. Or does anybody know about any, maybe, is this like a thing in any analytic philosopher, maybe?
I mean, I know Freud distinguished between Ding and Sache. I'm not quite clear on the details, but I think he actually had the opposite conception, where Sache was the more subjective kind of thing, whereas Ding was kind of objective, removed from any subjective projections.
But yeah, but in analytic philosophy, and this is basically where we're probably now kind of entering in a murky area, there's there are these conceptual distinctions between things and objects and facts as states of affairs, right? For example, Russell, if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I last revisited Russell.
Yeah. In Plessner writes, like, I think he contrasts like Sachverhalt and Feldverhalt.
Precisely.
And Feldverhalt is like more like situational, and the animals able like to perceive that, but not able like to perceive Sachverhalt.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this is basically what Philip was nicely kind of delineating, this distinction that with Feldverhalt, you basically have these structural components that are given and that are contextually determined, you might say. And by contextually means both by what the animal brings to the table and what is given in the field as such. So even though there is like the capacity to, let's say, restructure or shift, it is within the realm of the Funktionskreis, so this functional circle or cycle of the animal. So the sensory motor animal, or the let's say, we might also call it the somatic intentionality, is the one that kind of delineates the sphere or domain within which this can happen. So that this is very interesting. Like the distinctions that he draws here, for me, this is where really the well, some of the things before already also, of course, but some of the things here are just very, very interesting. Yeah, are there any other questions? Or so maybe pretty much with regards to this, because we would probably have to check the whole text. The useful way of thinking about it is object, Sachverhalte, and thing, Funktionsgehalte. So one is the human object, and then the other one, thing, animal, and that's probably the crucial distinction. But
the strict translation, I mean, the German for object would be Gegenstand, right?
Yeah,
okay.
I was just checking that. It seems like that's and objectivity
he
is
usually
Gegenständigkeit.
He usually does use Gegenstand from what I've managed to
especially
discern.
when he talks about like things given, that when he talks about things that are given to you in experience, like the intuition of a thing, then he talks about Gegenstand. Yeah.
And this is what kind of made me interested. Why did he suddenly use Sache in this context? Is there some nuance here that we have to pay attention to?
No,
Does the Sache present itself kind of differently than a Gegenstand?
I think it might be to prepare the Sachverhalt, which means facts. So I think in a way he's trying to slip in a kind of discussion of truth there. He's trying to say, like, you know, humans are able to distinguish, to think about things in terms of what they really are, like objective truth, or what's a fact. Does that seem right or no?
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. I think that because of the Sachverhalt, I mean, this is what he wants to play on. Now, the really interesting thing about this particular chapter is, for me, it's interesting because both Plessner and Merleau-Ponty in the first text, the structure of behavior, they both draw on Köhler, on his experiments, and they basically come to very similar conclusions, but in a slightly different manner. And if you read them in parallel, you can get a better understanding of their positions, which are very, very close, not necessarily identical, but very close. So maybe I would just point out two things from the structure of behavior that shed light on some of the things that Philip was saying with regards to how let's say human perception of the objects differs from the perception of the thinghood in animals, or things, or facts, or I don't know, things. Yeah. So Merleau-Ponty does a really, really cool exposition here, and he also draws on the examples from Köhler, where the chimpanzees got the thing wrong. So, for instance, he would point to the examples where an animal would use a certain thing. For example, you could teach the chimpanzee to use a branch to reach for bananas, for instance. But if the other animal was sitting on the branch, or if the branch was attached to a tree, even though it was like a dry tree and you could just easily break it off without any effort whatsoever, it would completely ignore this branch. It did not exist as a possible item that could be used to get the banana. So that's one thing. And then there's another example, which is somewhat similar to what you were saying, Philip, but basically here the animals failed. So the chimpanzees were taught to fetch the banana with a stick by pulling it towards themselves. But then the curler would put around this banana like a certain structure that was open only on one end, and this end was facing away from the chimpanzee. So what the chimpanzee had to do is push the banana away and around, and then towards itself, and it was unable to do so. So it would constantly just pull it toward itself unless during all these attempts, the banana found itself almost outside of the box. Then it would figure out that it can push it outside. But otherwise, it would just persist. And Merleau-Ponty notes, this is very strange if you think about it, because if the animal were allowed to go there with its body, it would immediately be able to get to the item. But when it had to move the item towards itself, that was something that was completely something that was extremely problematic for the animal, which seems strange from a human perspective, because if you go from A to B, clearly going from B to A is the identical route, but apparently not so for the animal. So he draws the following two conclusions from this, that what the chimps are lacking is, first of all, what he calls how does he call it? The multiplicity of perspective. So, for example, it is incapable to see the same thing if the aspect of the thing changes. So if you have a stick as a branch or a stick as a tool, once this restructuration happens, Merleau-Ponty would say, it's almost as if you had a shake of the kaleidoscope and a new structuration would appear. So there is no continuity, there is no invariant there as a thing. It has a specific meaning as long as it is embedded in its sensory motor loop. As soon as it is out of that, or it is kind of inserted into a different motor project, it shifts the meaning, and there's no longer a continuity. And another, perhaps even, okay, Timothy, bye. Another even more important thing, or more interesting thing is, this is the term that was given to this in the secondary literature, but it is referred to as the mobility of perception. So not only do you find in human beings the capacity to shift the perspective on something, but you can also shift the center of your perspective. So not only can you see the same thing from different aspects, but you can also position yourself in the thing and see the relationship of yourself towards that thing from the relationship of the thing. Now, the interesting thing is, this is not directly related to what we're talking about, but this is, so one of the interesting points here would be that this is why intersubjectivity precedes the perception of objectivity, because it's important to be able to position yourself in the other, take the position of the other to understand what the relationship of the other towards yourself is. Once you have this capacity, you can also use this to basically relate to the world at large. So not only do you have the mobility of perception, you also have the so not only do you have the multiplicity of perception, so this capacity to shift perspective, but also the mobility. And this is, how he thematizes this particular difference. And then you were asking, how do these different things come about? How do you get from thing to object and whatnot? And of course, Plessner's answer will be given in the next answer, where he will try to thematize the eccentricity of the human form. And if you think about it, eccentricity is precisely something that is related closely to these two capacities, where you basically are able to not only shift the perspective, but shift the center of the perspective in such a way that you are able to establish relationships towards yourself from the perspective that is not your own. So you basically get the realm of the possible. And this realm of the possible is constituted only by negating what is actual. So here you have the surplus of negativity allows, or is basically a manifestation of eccentricity, which allows the multiplicity of perspective and the mobility of the perspective. So this is an interesting, like a addition or an expansion of what Plessner does here. Was that clear somewhat?
Yeah, but it is pretty complicated stuff. I mean,
It is?
even to compare Merleau-Ponty and Plessner on these topics, to even understand Merleau-Ponty or Plessner on these topics.
Yeah, but is at least the logics clear? So as to what the because this fleshes out a little bit, for example, the surplus of negativity, what it means to have this capacity to negate, and how basically you can have a certain dynamics that you find in animals, but that basically just gets another complexity added to it, but thereby undergoes a qualitative shift. This will be laid out or thematized more clearly in the next chapter. But
well, so you say this is an
Yeah.
interesting question about eccentric positionality. So you say we're able to see ourselves from the position of the object. And I want to ask you how literally you mean that. And if you don't mean it literally, what do you mean?
okay, that's a good question. So I don't mean it in the sense that you project yourself into the object. You don't have to do this. What you have to have is the capacity that, just like, for instance, when you see an object, you don't see a two-dimensional something, but you see a three-dimensional something, even though actually you're giving only two sides. But you are also co-given what is only, virtual or what is merely possible. But the structure of the thing or the object, to use the terminology that we've agreed on, the structure of the object presupposes that it has sides that are not given to you actually, but only possibly or virtually. And it also has a center or a core, right? So we go to the very beginning of what we're saying here. So in the very same sense as an object needs to have these capacities, you don't necessarily have to project yourself in the sense of now I'm there and I have to see things from the other perspective, but the other thing has to be given as a potential anchor for me to be able to actually even have, these, to get to this density that you have in a thing, to have these possibilities. So in the sense of what I'm trying to say is, it's not that you have to actually or literally position yourself into that, but the mode of your experience is such that everything that is given to you actually is always surrounded by the field of virtuality, the field of possibility. And this is precisely what stands for your capacity to either project yourself or shift your position. So in other words, again, this means that you do not have to shift your perspective all the time for you to get to the thing. But because you are an organism of a specific type, that is to say an eccentric organism, you have your structure, your experiential field or existential field will be such that it will be populated not only by actualities and what is real, but also what is co-given as a virtuality or possibility.
But let me ask you, do you think that higher animals don't perceive their environments with that kind of virtuality? And what is different between, I assume the answer is that they do, that higher animals experience the tree, the thing, as something that affords various possibilities of interaction, which is a kind of virtuality. So how do we get from that kind of virtuality to this other level of virtuality that you're saying constitutes the human?
Yeah, the way this, so okay, let me try to formulate this.
I love this conversation because I've thought about this a lot in trying to make sense of what Plessner's saying, and whether or not I agree with it or whether or not it's actually compelling.
So the way that I would respond to this is as follows. So the animal is given a certain something that has a specific meaning to it, which is related to its specific mode of embodiment. So it is a specific type of living organism, and it will see things surrounding it as affordances of a specific type. So in a certain sense, the animal lives in the virtual in the sense of that it is not under the influence of physical chemical factors. Okay, so but it is given what it is relevant to it. Now, you as a human being, for instance, or I myself as a human being, I will also see a tree as a maybe, providing some affordances. But in addition to that, this tree will always be permeated by the domain of possibilities, whereby I can break away from one specific attitude towards that tree and take another one, and it will acquire a different meaning. Whereas as an animal, this is precisely what is not given to it. And let me just add further layers to this. One layer is, of course, some meanings you have been kind of taught to see in things. Yeah. So for instance, you will use a certain something for drinking. So immediately you will see that. And maybe because you've already played this game, you will also see it as a weapon or whatnot, where you have this. So there is this variability of meanings. But not only that, what can happen is that if somebody put you on the spot, or if you find yourself in a position where something needs to happen, you can basically look at this thing, and even though the potential alternative meanings are not given clearly to you, they are given as something that is indeterminate and constitutes the possibilities that surround it. And you can, in a certain sense, position yourself in different ways that will eventually allow you to find an attitude that will give you a novel significance or meaning in the same object, so to speak. So in other words, there is a certain plasticity or radical plasticity that is given to you that is not given in animals. In animals, of course, there is a certain plasticity.
Okay.
And I would even claim that with regards to the memory and the teaching capacity that we are talking about here, this can be expanded to a certain extent. But there is not like this, let's say, in principle capacity to break through a meaning in order to land into a new one, and making this into a practice, a systematic practice.
Okay, two questions. One, is this a difference in kind or a difference in degree? Is it just that there's more plasticity, more virtuality with humans, and that's
so
what gets
I'm
us
going to give an answer that you won't like.
Hold on, second question. Is this not something that's contingent on particular, say, phases or modes of human operation? Because if we think about like small scale societies, we think about some human communities, they may be like less eccentric, less virtual than others, right? So both of those, what would you say to those two questions?
Okay, so first question, I would respond that it's a qualitative difference. The second one is, yes, I would agree. There are different ways or modes and methods of cultivating eccentricity. However, it is profoundly erroneous to think of eccentricity as being either exclusively or primarily related to scientific endeavor. So there are different modes of cultivating eccentricity. And for instance, different types of rituals, mythologies, the use of, psychoactive substances and whatnot. These are all modes of breaking through specific patterns or living in specific symbolic, let's say, structurations, and cultivating this capacity to shift perspectives in different ways. So I would say that, yeah, of course, you have different cultures, they have established different modes of doing this, but in a certain sense, I would agree, I would argue that in all cultures, cultivating the capacity of eccentricity is at the very center of culture.
Great. Now thank you. No, it's really good. I mean, yeah.
Maybe if we just allow someone else to chime in.
Sounds
so
good.
Because I was actually, by the way, the things that I was saying now are not necessarily Plessnerian or Merleau-Pontian. We were now going in direction which were already Verushian. But anyway, yeah, maybe.
Did you describe it? How did you describe it, Moros? It was what?
Verush. That's how you pronounce it. Verush.
Voroshian. Okay.
Verushian, yeah. Yeah, any other thoughts on this? I mean, was this making any sense, or was it like clear what we were ping-ponging about here? Or was this a very niche type of thing?
No, I found it like very helpful actually, and very interesting. Like, yeah, because I like Philip, like I thought about these things, and like it was very nice, like that you summarized your view on it.
One of the good things here also is that you see how this then can tie in nicely with, for example, certain other explorations. For example, the explorations of the symbol and how symbol is different from, for example, from conceptuality, and also why, for example, you know, mindedness is not necessarily something that is related to having this capacity to manipulate certain symbols in an algorithmic fashion, which is in a certain sense the ideal put forward by Descartes, but is more closely related to the capacity to restructuration or transformation in the sense of umgestalten, precisely this capacity to break through and restructure. So that's also, I think that I found this these thoughts very helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a traditional distinction made between like the animal Umwelt and the human Welt, or the human world.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of ways of kind of reading that. But one way that I found informative is to think that it's not that humans don't experience the world in structures like that of the animal Umwelt. It's that they're never restricted by any particular structure like that. And to some extent, our claim that they're not restricted by any particular structure is a kind of induction, because what we have is like lots of evidence of human beings pushing through, as you're putting it, pushing through a particular framework, seeing things different from how they saw them before. But, you know, I think we have enough evidence there, or we sort of like in reflection as philosophers can say, that's evidence that there's a potentially unrestricted capacity to push through any particular Umwelt. And we also have the, so anyway, that I find it interesting to think about how that's connected with concepts like objectivity and things like that.
But one of the things that is really interesting here, and it's very important as well, is the capacity that once you have this ability to do what we were now talking about, so let's call it transcendence in a very specific or delimited sense of the word. Once you have this, what you get is the capacity to basically use different behavioral structures to express the meaning of other behavioral structures. So I can maybe, for instance, do a certain movement or that can, that has specific structure, and I do this movement instead of performing some other function. So for instance, instead of grabbing you or I don't know, hitting you, I produce, check this out, I open my mouth and like these noises come out, and I basically say something that has a meaning that expresses that particular potential thing that I didn't carry out, precisely because I don't have to, because I know that I can basically, perform a different meaning and can express the same, and can express what that other meaning means. But, and this here I will really stop. Once you do this, you literally change the thing that you are expressing. So after you know that you're able to use a different behavioral pattern to express the meaning of some other behavioral pattern, for example, something that you might call is more natural, then this natural meaning acquires a horizon of different possibilities and thereby is changed. So even though you are still a living being and you have to eat, you have to have sex, I don't know, whatever, all of a sudden food becomes not only something to nourish you, but also something to show off, something that can become a sexual fetish, something that can become, I don't know, a mode of manipulation, something that can become a symbol for something completely different. So this is really intriguing. This domain of symbol which enters at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting thinking about these things at this point a lot. It's easy to have the, I'm sorry, I'll be quiet in just a moment, Letitia. I'll be quiet right now. Letitia, I would like to hear your comment.
No, please, Philip, finish. It's nothing. You can finish.
Okay, sorry. Just the one point that I think what I read a lot as a philosopher of science, philosopher of biology, stuff. I see a lot of stuff that emphasizes how similar human beings are to non-human animals. But when you make the point that you just made about language and a lot of the other stuff that comes up here, I think it's like there's almost a reverse problem. It's troubling how different human beings are from non-human animals. It's troubling, like, to understand the difference is really emphasized. And I think that it's sort of, there are so many differences, like on this on this slide here, right? You include things like language. Those are just, there are so many differences that it's hard to make sense of what is there sort of a single source of all of the differences, which is what, you know, somebody like Plessner is trying to argue for.
That's a good point. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a question. I don't know if it makes sense, but I was thinking more in terms of evolution. Can we think, I don't know, these restructuration or these new uses of things? Life itself is doing that with the different species. They find new solutions for things, and they use things in the world differently. So can we think about this in terms of evolution? Their animals will have some sort of intelligence or sense of negativity.
I was thinking of that. The thing is, this is the way I like to think about it. In animal realm, you have to have constantly new individuals that try to solve a certain problem and die off massively while doing so. The capacity that we were talking about now allows you to create virtual individuals that try to solve the problem, and you kill them off, but virtually. So one individual can actualize several solutions to the problem without having to die biologically. So this would be, you know, one major difference in this regard. And by the way, a really interesting author in this regard would be Tomasello. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he wrote like several books, and he is kind of developing something along this similar lines from a very, let's say, evolutionary perspective, where he emphasizes the importance of the cultural evolution and how it brings about some of these differences that we are talking about. And he provides some really, at least for me, this was very interesting, the things that he develops. Laura?
Have you read Dennis Walsh in this field? Like, he is like a evolutionary biologist at University of Toronto, and he, I would say, is like in a similar project, which I found very interesting. I just wrote an essay about him, so this was like about his idea of the adaptive repertoire and like how evolutionary novelties can occur. So yeah.
Yeah, this is very interesting. Yeah, for sure. So I was kind of puzzled by precisely this, what you were saying. Like, I was kind of thinking, and the somehow during our reading group on Canguilhem, this idea first kind of appeared to me. I don't know why, Primush, maybe you will remember, but he talks something about, like, I forgot what it was something about evolution, and then this idea kind of popped up in the sense of, wow, you basically have the same process, but you know, it becomes structured in a way where you don't have to kill off that many different concrete individuals, but you have the capacity to basically, in the realm of virtual, kind of do something that is structurally similar to what happens there. That's one way of thinking about it, at least.
Can I just clarify what you mean? So with this killing off, and like that, like one individual has like there are more ways to respond to a situation, and what becomes actualized is like this is where like evolutionary change and innovation can happen, and you don't need like multiple individuals trying different solutions, because like one has like this virtuality.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe, you know, if I give a very simple example, and it's probably not the best, But you've probably all seen that those movies where you have I don't know how many young frogs or young crabs that are laid out, or small turtles that try to make it to the sea, and you have like a ton of different small turtles that are minutely different among each other, and then a certain specific constellation of properties and also the situations in the environment take care of only, I don't know, 5% of them surviving or something like that, and massively they die off. And all these different concrete individuals that have been actualized there are just, kind of die. But here you have this capacity that I was talking about, where you're able to shift your perspective, and the perspective is mobile, which allows you to, first of all, basically alternate your view with regards to a certain something, but also change constantly that certain something. And both yourself and your world can be altered. So you can develop techniques where you can alter both yourself and the world, and you can do it in different ways. And some of them work, some of them don't. You see? And even if you get burned, so for example, you can try something out, but you see it doesn't work. So you go and try to do something else. You don't necessarily have to die. Yeah. Whereas when you're I intentionally use like these small turtles or something like that. It becomes more complicated with chimpanzees and everything.
So I mean, isn't what you're talking about learning? And I mean, is it? And there are different kinds of learning, right? So there's a kind of learning where, a behavioral program is set by repeated experience.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's a kind of learning where a set of potential responses is developed
Mm-hmm.
to variety of situations.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, the second, I think, is rarer than the first.
Mm-hmm.
And the ability to kind of toggle between different responses to different situations is fairly rare.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe it's characteristic of humans and a few other higher mammals, but that kind of like problem solving or kind of toggling between options. So I think it's plausible that it's a different kind of selection, but there's already selection happening with learning in general, which is a kind of higher level than like
For sure.
natural selection.
For sure.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a large literature here on like kind of selection models for individual psychology, learning, group psychology, or like, cultural evolution. That's a whole other topic of like practices being passed on and some surviving or dying off.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of mentioning a bit of the larger literature there, which I think people here are probably familiar with to some extent.
I'm not to a larger degree, so that's definitely very useful, because I've learned that at this point some of the ideas that I've been developing by working with these authors like Merleau-Ponty and Plessner and some others, and also with Varela and some people related to that I need to complement this also with authors like Tomasello, for instance, where you have like these more, let's say, up-to-date studies about certain things that can be useful with regards to what you're doing, and also allow you to maybe articulate some of the things in a more accessible manner, because sometimes you can kind of have a pretty good idea about how, so you see a certain useful pattern develop itself, but it's difficult to articulate it sometimes. So for this reason, also cultivating the dialogue with these more recent researchers, that's definitely useful. So if you have any suggestions, feel free also to maybe send me some titles or names or whatever. I would be very grateful for that. But only if you have time, and if this is something that would not be an issue. Okay, marvelous. I can then also copy paste them, and I'll send them just in the email as well, if somebody's interested. Yeah, any other topics or questions? Maybe also moving away from this particular theme. Anything? I mean, it was a very rich second part for sure.
I mean, I'm fascinated by his work on memory,
Mhm.
and what he's writing there. First of all, because the writing is so beautiful as well. I don't know. I feel like I don't have. I mean, it's just like sometimes I feel myself like the writing is so beautiful that I'm just reading and enjoying, but I actually, when I'm trying to understand what he's saying, for instance,
Yeah.
first, why is the organism like in a distance to its past, and why does he describe the distance as an inner pause?
Mhm.
So I guess like one way I would answer this lecture myself would be just like, it's not like this stimulus reaction, like there's like this space for creativity. But I found it still interesting that he's like using like a pause or like this temporal terms to describe like this distance. I don't know why he uses even distance to describe that. I don't know. Yeah.
Anybody want to give a go? I don't want to, because otherwise I have the impression like I'm just babbling on, so this is not good. Philip makes a good point where he points out these things.
Laura, you were asking about the distance component. Why does there have to be distance in order for there to be memory? Was that the question? Sorry, can you repeat the
Distance with
question?
regards to the organism's past. So why is there a distance and pause, for instance?
Right. I think in order to get the distinction between non-living and living memory, so or non-living effect of the past and the effect of the past on living things in the form of memory. I mean, if a truck, I mean, I say truck, could try to pick something that if a rock falls on the leg of a coyote and breaks the coyote's leg, right? Then that's kind of like the gramophone record being, or the record being imprinted, the grooves on the record being imprinted. It's just an effect of the past on the coyote's body. But the memory component is something different, right? So in order to have memory, you have to have some kind of difference between what happens, the past, and how it affects or what it means to the organism. And that distance is the distance that we're talking about. And so you need to have a thing that can be distant from the past, which on Plessner's account is the center of this organism. Its frontality, its center. And it's related to that. The relation is, I mean, the relation is only dynamic or only something other than just like a cause-effect relation if there's a distance there, if there's a kind of opposition or there's a mediation, as he sometimes calls it. So you can think about mediation as another way of talking about distance, because mediation is like, it's like there's something standing between the organism and its past, or the subject or the self and the past, or what happens, or what's happened. And that mediation on Plessner's account, like that what's mediating the incorporation of the past, or what's mediating the relation to the past, is the frontality, as he calls it, the directedness of the organism, its basically its positionality, its its dynamic relation with its environment. So it has a dynamic relation with its past, just like it has a dynamic relation with its environment. It is related to the past in whatever way, in ways that are relevant to its ongoing projects. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I found it interesting that he's like, the way he describes the past is like using the future, which is like a very interesting move. Yeah, and very fascinating.
Oh, this is a good point. And Philip, that was a really good clarification again. So basically, the whole thing I would just add is what he's been talking about till now. You know, basically the positionality and the nature of positionality is such that when you have a living organism, that organism is never encapsulated or captured with what in what you see when you see a living organism, but it is always already ahead of itself. So there is always, you know, this, you might call it basically here a rudimentary intentionality, where the animal is always thrown ahead of itself because it has to be thrown ahead of itself, because it has to actively provide for what it needs in order to simply be. So that's why the organism is always anchored in the futurity. And because of this being anchored in the future, because of this element of anticipation, because the organism in a certain sense knows or is directed towards what it needs to sustain itself, it will filter in what will be relevant for it. So it will be presented by a totality of everything there is, but it will break it down. And this will get sedimented. And that is why not everything that will, in a certain sense, physico-chemically stimulate that organism will be relevant for that organism as a memory. Sure, it will be there. There will be these engravings, but they will not be crucial for the memory. So you have anticipation, which provides filtering, and then you get a sedimentation of relevant content. But here's an interesting thing. Once you get the sedimentation of relevant content, this sediment will influence the anticipatory move. So you get memory influencing anticipation, which influences what will be remembered. And again, you get this interesting loop. And there's the organism in between, which is not merely something that the past passes through as it goes to the future. So you don't just have cause effect, as Philip put it, but you have a certain something that establishes a loop that has a different structuration and different meaning. And if you overlook it, you simply, in a certain sense, you kind of overlook the whole process. So it's a nice scheme for sure. Philip, you wrote something. Trying to read. I think there is a... You can.
Sorry, I'm just throwing. I just throw everything at you guys and to see what sticks.
No, but it's good. Okay, maybe one thing that I would like to kind of ask you, or maybe say what I also found interesting is, you all know that within the autopoietic tradition and in activism, there's this idea of, well, the notion of an action is present, and basically the notion of an action is, at least in the Varelian understanding of embodied cognition, is related to the surplus of meaning or significance or signification. That's how it's called, right? So once you have a living being, you get this surplus of meaning or significance, which you don't find if you just observe, say, physical or physical-chemical entities. For instance, sucrose, yeah, becoming food. So you get the meaning, significance of food or of prey or what have you. But the interesting thing is that with regards to this, there was a thesis that was developed, which is called life-mind continuity thesis, where basically, you know, the mind and the human cognition is continuous with life. I find Plessner's musings, and Merleau-Ponty's as well, about the surplus of negativity a really, really good addition to this debate, where you can have, you know, signification, but there is a certain something added, or better put, or perhaps even better phrased, taken away, that then provides for a certain qualitative difference or qualitative shift in the modes of cognition that you would find in say, something that is related strictly to vitality and something that is related to, once you get, say, mentality proper. Okay, and let's not get bogged down by the terminology. We can of course use mind in the broader sense, but this is just, you know, a matter of terminological debate. So this is what, does anybody have any thoughts on this, you know, about life mind continuity? And then with Plessner, you basically get an addition. So in addition to surplus of significance, you get a surplus of negativity. And this for me was like, wow, that's a brilliant, that's a brilliant move. I like that, you know, there's a surplus, but it's not of significance, but of negativity. So yeah, I don't know if this is something that's of interest.
Yeah, I think that to have these multiplicity of meanings, it's almost the same to say that it's a surplus of negativity, right?
Yeah, precisely.
Like the multiplicity of perspectives. Like
yeah, precisely. Because it's precisely the capacity to, let's say, in a certain sense, say no, to negate. And it's also then how interesting how he then talks about, you know, the empty spaces and whatnot, and how this is related. So that's also interesting.
But I don't know, I'm still not completely convinced, I think, about this lack of negativity in animals, because I was thinking maybe there are some very mundane examples, but for instance, when animals play, it's not something directly related to survival, something that is useless from the perspective of evolution, but they transform an object in something to play. Can we say that there is a negativity there, or no?
I would say that this is within the realm of the plasticity of what Plessner would talk about as, you know, the animals, higher developed animals, having things not being just caught up in. So, for instance, when he talks about the spider having just complex qualities, this means that basically you can have a dead fly and it won't recognize a dead fly, but you can have something that's moving like a fly and it would think it's a fly, because it's just like, you know, qualities, and it has no. So when you get to the complex animals, they are able to identify, say, particular things within specific contexts. And I would say that play is one of the ways, or one of the one of the things that allows for this. It is through play that you get that you learn that there are not only, let's say, complex qualities, but individual things, because you have to toy around with them. You have to be able to, you know, establish various relationships between your own bodily attitude towards the thing, and you have to see how these loops unfold themselves. So you have to see how these melodies, as they are sometimes called kinetic melodies, unfold. And you have to do this somehow, and play is a magnificent way of doing it, because you're basically, you know, when the kittens are tackling or fighting with one another, like there are all these different movements. You're basically exploring your bodily schema and how the bodily schema of the other beings is responding, or if you have an object, how the object will respond in a specific way. And this is also why, for example, the kittens that weren't able to interact actively were basically behaving as if they were blind. Yeah, so there were no, so you know that famous experiment from the 60s, right? Hildenhain, yeah. So that's a very telling experiment, like a very, very interesting experiment, I think. So I would say that for sure there's this capacity, but then you can think of the additional negativity is being capable of, for example, recognizing the things that you do with objects that are very different or in very different settings as something that is related, so that you, for example, recognize that playing with your mate, or playing with a ball, or playing with something else has a similar dynamic, and you start behaving towards it in a similar manner. For instance, so the capacity to kind of, again, it's one thing to explore this particular domain, but still, for example, Plessner would say that this is within the sensory motor schema, and it can be plastic. It's like he says about instincts. So instincts for him are like very open.
May I ask a question, Uka? I feel like I'm super dark, actually.
Actually, you're very
just like speaking out of the white. So plasticity. So just because I was reading Bergson, and he, I would say, understands plasticity in temporal terms as the past. But what that means is then that the organism not only preserves what is useful for the future, but almost like, yeah, like a surplus, like there's like more memorized than is needed. And like in order to have this virtuality, like to have like a certain play, or like the ability to generate like different responses. Is this the way to think about it, or?
That's an interesting way to think about it. So, for instance, you will probably remember that Plessner says explicitly that he's not trying to say that, for instance, engrams are not important. So they are, for example, like these traces in the central nervous system, they are important for him. But the thing is, they are to be understood in a similar manner that, for example, a certain aspect or domain or a segment of the visual field needs to be understood. So it depends on how the field will be oriented, what the meaning of this particular aspect will be. So you get a certain, you get certain traces, but then depending on how that particular animal will relate with the world, this surplus will be able to become included in its attitude towards the world. So it can become part of the meaning or not, and it can become maybe also in different manners, depending on the developmental cycles, depending on in which state or phase the animal finds itself. So for sure there would be a certain surplus, and I think that okay, here's one way to think about it. When you're engaging in play or game, what happens is that you're broadening the horizon of anticipation, because you're learning the capacities of your, let's say, motor schema, and you can see how this can be done. And in this regard, the filters will also be different, because if anticipation is what impacts the sedimentation, then if you broaden this horizon within the space allotted for a particular form, then this would then contribute to a different type of filtering, and even then you're impacted by more things that you necessarily filter out, and this more can be added later on in a certain sense. Primož, do you have any maybe questions or comments, or no?
Not today.
Today you're the person on Twitter that just observes and doesn't respond.
I'm the listener, practicing listening skills.
Unbeteiligte Beobachter, huh? Like a player. Yeah, okay, then maybe at this point we can call it quits. This was a very productive session. I think maybe just because I was talking too much. These were the things that I'm actually working on. So that's why I was kind of grateful that Chris was asking some of these questions. Yeah, because then you try to articulate them and you see that you can do it to a certain degree, but you still fail. So the next meeting is in 3 weeks, right?
Yep.
Primož, then you won't be able to be silent, given that you're the presenter.
Nope.
Yeah, so thank you very much for coming, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll be seeing you in 3 weeks, right? Yeah. Be well.
Bye.
Fine.
Ciao.